When Amanda Carter disappeared, her killer thought he'd got off scot-free, but he hadn't considered the future. A revolution in forensic science was about to happen, and a team of detectives had a very long memory.
Mr. Carter had reported his daughter missing to the police, and they were concerned about her safety, basically, because it wasn't in her nature to not go home of an evening. They told us Mandy and Debbie had gone out on the Saturday night to celebrate Mandy's birthday, which was on that following Monday, that they were a very close-knit family. Mandy, Debbie and Brenton still lived at home.
Very nice environment for a young girl to grow up in. A very loving, warm family, and normally we wouldn't be that concerned about somebody aged 21 not arriving home, but they assured us that she regularly came home.
We went through her belongings there just to see, for example, if there was any clothing missing, bags missing, bank books missing, which would indicate to us perhaps that she'd run away or wasn't going to come home that night, but there was nothing to indicate that.
So the warning bells rang fairly early in the piece, and it didn't seem to be just a normal missing person.
Immediately, police started to piece together what they could of Amanda's last movements.
Debbie, the sister we spoke to, she told us that they'd been to a number of hotels the night before. They had been enjoying themselves in the evening. They'd had a little bit to drink, and after midnight, when they were down at the Hope and Anchor, Debbie didn't have a very good recollection at all of what she did, who she was with, and where her sister was. A lot of people had talked to her at Mandy Carter, but there was nothing to suggest that she was going to do anything out of the ordinary. Everybody that we spoke to that knew her said that they thought she would go home by taxi, and that was her usual method of getting home.
So we started making inquiries with taxi companies just to ascertain as to who was working that night.
I was driving cab 99 in and around the Hobart area. It was a rather busy night. I told police that I'd seen a figure hunched up in the doorway of the old CML building at around about 2:45, 3 o'clock in the morning.
In fact, a number of taxi drivers reported the same sighting.
Nobody could say for sure that was Mandy Carter. A lot of people said it looked like her, and it seemed a logical taxi rank for her to go.
However, the times of the sightings varied between 1:30 and 3:30 a.m.
But about 3 taxi drivers said that they saw a yellow taxi at the front of the cab stand and in the area where this girl was sitting on the steps.
One of the taxi drivers had seen a taxi driver go up to the CML steps and pick up a handbag and throw it into the taxi. This taxi was right in front of him, so he identified that taxi, and it was cab 58.
58's picked up a handbag.
That was obviously an avenue of inquiry we wanted to seriously look at because Mandy had a handbag with her, so there was a possibility that this handbag belonged to Mandy Carter.
One cab driver even suggested to us that he thought that the girl sitting on the steps actually got into that cab and the cab drove away. Now, if that was the case, we may have Mandy Carter leaving the CML steps, and it was important that we got hold of that taxi driver as soon as possible.
Amanda Carter's 22nd birthday dawned. She had been missing for 24 hours. Police began searching Hobart for any sign of her. They were also on the lookout for a yellow cab, number 58.
The yellow cab was owned by a fellow called Wayne Highland.
I think it was about the only yellow Falcon on the road at the time as a taxi.
And about 5 o'clock, we actually found him out at the airport.
So John Blue and I went out there immediately, found Highland with his cab, and when we opened the boot, we found a handbag in the boot.
He told us that he'd found it at the CML steps on the Saturday night, Sunday morning, and he had intended to hand it into the cab office, which he hadn't done. If she's got Mandy's handbag in the car, well, there's a potential that Mandy was in here as well. So he must know something. We thought This is a real potential suspect.
Amanda Carter had been missing for 48 hours when police found what they believed was her handbag in the boot of a yellow taxi. That taxi was impounded and the driver, Wayne Highland, was now being questioned.
We spoke to Highland at the police headquarters. He told us that Saturday night, Sunday morning, he'd been at the GPA. He'd spoken to a female there who has been sitting on the steps and asked her if she wanted a cab. She said she didn't and she was waiting for a friend. He then got back into his cab and drove round to the cab rank in Murray Street outside Myer. He got a fare there out to Windermere. Then he came back into the city, went back to the GPA, and he then said that he went up to the steps again and there found a handbag. This was the handbag that we found in his car. The woman that he'd spoken to on the GPA steps, he wasn't obviously able to identify her as Mandy Carter because he didn't know her, but from the description that we gave him, he said it could have been her.
Was the girl he saw Amanda Carter? And if so, who was she waiting for? More importantly, at this stage, was the bag picked up by the taxi driver that of Amanda's?
We were pretty confident it was going to be Mandy Carter's handbag, but there were no credit cards, no identifying things in the handbag at all, but it was very similar to the handbag that had been described as being Amanda Carter's handbag.
So we went down to Taroona and spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Carter and Debbie, showed them the handbag, and to our bewilderment and astonishment, they said no, it wasn't her handbag.
They were quite adamant about it, and we said, well, we think it is. And they said, no, sorry, it's not her handbag, and we know her handbag, and that's not it. So straight away, we gave a lot of media, and we said, here's a handbag, we want to know whose it is.
Detectives have interviewed the taxi driver who found the handbag and who had previously talked to the woman, asking her if she needed a cab. The woman is of similar appearance to Mandy Carter, and police urgently want to talk with her.
We looked at different scenarios. One possible scenario was that she'd picked up the wrong handbag when she left the Hope and Anchor, and that somebody else had Mandy's handbag. But if that was the case, nobody came forward with Mandy's handbag. Another scenario was that Mandy Carter wasn't on the CML steps at all, and that it was some other female, and who was she? And if it wasn't Mandy, where did Mandy go after she left the Hope and Anchor?
Luckily, Amanda's sister Debbie started to recall events of that night at the hotel.
Debbie was able to recall that she and Amanda departed from the Hope and Anchor Hotel the early hours of the 27th in company with two male companions. They accompanied these two unknown men up Macquarie Street. We think that they walked separately, Mandy walking with one male and Debbie walking with the other male. She believed that when they reached the mall area, they parted, and she assumed that Amanda was going to the taxi rank to catch a taxi en route home.
So it was absolutely essential we identify these two men, because it may well have been that Mandy had gone with this man and that he was the person responsible for her disappearance.
We had various descriptions, but in essence, they were people that were in their 20s, and one was described as a man with a beard.
We were very lucky in some sense, because one of the guys had a bright red beard. You know, basically we plastered the media with calls of help to try and get these guys.
As far as we knew, she may well have gone with them, and she may not have been on the taxi stand at all, or she may have been on the taxi stand and then decided to leave with one of those two fellows, and she may be still with them.
This could well have been the person the taxi driver had said Amanda had been waiting for.
I'm waiting for someone.
But like the owner of the bag, the bearded man didn't come forward.
Last night, the Hobart Police Headquarters switchboard was jammed with calls immediately after the Attorney-General, Brian Miller, announced on television that the state government had offered a reward of up to $10,000 for information on Miss Carter's whereabouts.
Wild rumours began circulating, with Amanda sighted all over Australia.
We had a report that she may have gone to Cairns with an ex-boyfriend.
There was people saying she was a drug runner.
We had reports that she was at Swansea on the east coast of Tasmania in a log truck.
She'd gone to Queensland with a bikie gang.
We had various clairvoyants ringing up and saying, well, we can tell you where she is, and all these ridiculous propositions that one way or another you've probably got to follow up, because you've got to be in a position to say, yes, that's been followed up and we're satisfied there's nothing in it.
For Mandy's father, Don Carter, the past week has been desperate.
Anybody who could throw any light or has seen anything that may be a bit unusual, just to come forward and tell the police.
You've got some information for me, have you?
After about 6 days of the investigation, we received an anonymous call at police headquarters to say that 3 well-known criminals had left the state on the Sunday afternoon. She went missing on the early as Sunday morning, and that they'd left the state and she'd gone with them. And they had left, and they were due to report on bail conditions on the Monday. And on the Monday they didn't report for bail conditions. We thought that that was a real possibility, that perhaps she'd gone with them, that she may have been abducted.
Amanda Carter had been missing now for over a week. Police had information she may have been abducted by 3 known fugitives who had fled the state.
We received a call from the police in Mackay in North Queensland, and they said those fellows that absconded bail in Tasmania, we've found them in a stolen car in Mackay, and we've got them in custody. I went to Queensland, and after interviewing them all, I was quite satisfied that they weren't involved in the disappearance of the girl. They even admitted committing a crime on the Saturday night that she went missing, and in fact they were terrified that they were looked on as key suspects.
Another lead down, and the police were still no closer to finding Amanda Carter or the 2 men last seen with her at the Hope and Anchor Tavern.
The 2 mystery men still kept coming up in our inquiry. We had to try and identify them. We just weren't able to. It was just bizarre that this guy with the bright red beard could have slipped away and nobody knew who he was.
They were crucial because they were probably the last 2 people to see Mandy and Debbie after they left the Hope and Anchor. We certainly were concerned about it because we thought, well, if they've got nothing to hide, why wouldn't they come forward?
As detectives continued their search for these 2 main witnesses, or prime suspects, the results from the forensic examination on the yellow taxi were coming in. At the time it was impounded, police believed the brown bag found in its boot had belonged to Amanda Carter.
The taxi was being examined as a missing person case. We were looking for any evidence for Amanda Carter being present in that taxi. I collected a Fanta can on which we were looking for saliva. It was an empty can, so someone had obviously drunk it. And there was a tartan rug which was in the boot, which was taken for looking for human hair fibres or any contact which might lead us to where we were looking for the missing person. On the right-hand side, on one of the mudguard ornaments, there was a small amount of what looked like reed material.
We couldn't find anything to connect Mandy Carter to that particular taxi. But in the middle of the back seat, the forensic people found a stain. And when we asked them what it was, they described it as a seminal stain, suggesting to us that somebody had either masturbated on the back seat or that somebody had had intercourse on the back seat of that taxi.
The scientists basically thought the stain must have been reasonably recent because if it had been a taxi, people would go coming in and out the taxi and it would eventually disappear.
So it needed some sort of explanation.
Hyland was interviewed about that, as to whether he'd had sexual intercourse, and he said he hadn't. And he was even asked us, for example, had he masturbated, and he also said he hadn't.
He said that he was the only one that drove the cab, So chances are that he was the contributor.
So it was important to try and get his blood group in, so we asked him for his blood, and he refused to give it, which he was quite entitled to do, I might add, as well.
The stain and his refusal to give blood rang alarm bells. But his alibi of taking his last passenger to Windermere in the early hours of Sunday morning checked out.
We eventually found the woman, and she confirmed that she had been taken home by a taxi driver in a car similar to Highlands, and that he fitted the description, and that was consistent. So that took the heat off him a little bit, and we had to look at alternatives.
A revised identikit picture was issued by police today, who hope the man may be able to add to Debbie's statements. After more than a week's search, police say they are both frustrated and baffled by the disappearance.
Attention was back on Debbie, Amanda's 19-year-old sister.
Debbie was traumatised. Of course it wasn't her fault, but she did in some degree blame herself. If they had remained together, she would have been safe.
It was really frustrating, the fact that Debbie wasn't able to give us any information, or very limited amount of information.
In desperation, the police asked Debbie to undergo hypnosis.
We had been working really long hours, 17, 18 hours a day, and the hypnotherapist was talking in a very monotone voice.
My recollection is myself and John Blue went to sleep. And but it was worth a try. We didn't achieve a lot, but it was worth a try. And at that stage, we were trying every avenue to try and get a lead. So we thought just a small thing may have helped us in the investigation, but didn't happen.
Then 2 weeks after Amanda disappeared, the police got a breakthrough.
This young fella at Tudder on the west coast of Tasmania picked up a week-old newspaper and saw what he thought looked very much like him as an identikit picture in the paper. Contacted police, and he was our man.
It was a major breakthrough when we had the two people come forward and say, "Excuse me, but we are the people that you're looking for." They were Stanley Hibbins and Lester Govett. One had a red beard, so they were quite sure that they were the people.
Both men had left Hobart on the Sunday and had claimed to have no knowledge of Amanda's disappearance.
But they recalled everything that occurred, and they said, yes, we went to the Hope and Anchor. We met Mandy Carter and her sister Debbie, and we talked to them at the Hope and Anchor. And afterwards, we left with them, and they said they put the time at about 2:30. They said they walked up Macquarie Street. Lester Govett said that he was with Debbie.
Oh, look, it's an
Stanley Hibbins said he was with Mandy. Stanley Hibbins decided to make a phone call home to his parents in Victoria.
Oh, Mum. Yeah, no, it's me.
So he leaves Mandy to make the phone call, and he's talking to his mum for perhaps about 15 minutes, he says. When he goes back, Mandy had gone.
Is he all right? Yeah, good.
We actually went to Victoria and spoke to his parents, and they verified that they received the call in the early hours of the morning. Govett took it a step further because he said prior to leaving the GPO, he actually had a conversation with Mandy. He yelled out to her across the road, and at that stage she was intending to catch a taxi home.
Yeah, I'm fine, I've got money.
All right then, we'll see you later.
Okay, see you later. Bye.
That gelled pretty well with what we knew. Virtually said to us that the female on the CML steps opposite the GPO was in all probability Mandy Carter. So we had a time and we had an intention, and I think after that, that directed our investigations in a certain way, and that way was along the lines of what we first thought, that she probably got in a taxi.
Amanda Carter had been celebrating her 22nd birthday. At approximately 3 a.m, she separated from her sister and the two men she had been celebrating with to catch a taxi home. Numerous cab drivers had seen a woman matching her description near the taxi rank. Some believed she had got into the taxi owned by Wayne
We were aware that Hyland had previous convictions for assault and stealings and burglaries, but nothing of a serious nature.
He was basically what I would call a small-time crook, a bit of a sleaze bag. Arrogant, I would call his attitude, an arrogant attitude, and fairly cocky.
But the police had nothing to link Hyland to Amanda's disappearance, except a suspicious stain on the back seat of the cab that was now providing some new information.
There's a possibility that stain on the back seat of the taxi was just from an act of masturbation, and all you would find would be sperm, but there was a female component. And when you see that, you know you've got a compound stain.
The forensic people thought that there were two separate blood groupings in that particular stain. The contributors were a male and a female, so that we deduced from that, and we thought it was reasonable that probably a male and female had intercourse on the back seat of that taxi.
But at the time we took the samples from the taxi, we didn't have a sample from Amanda, we didn't have a body or anything, so basically there was nothing to do a comparison with.
Wayne Hyland had already refused to give a sample of his blood for comparison testing. But the detectives decided to question him again in what they described as a robust interview.
Over a period of 4 or 5 hours, he was interrogated, he was interviewed, he was spoken to, he's conferred with. All manner and means in relation to information was put to him. He emphatically denied any knowledge of Amanda's whereabouts.
He was adamant that he hadn't picked up Mandy Carter. He was adamant that he never had her in his taxi. He still couldn't explain the stain on the back seat.
How did the seminal stains appear on the rear seat of your vehicle, be it a taxi or a private vehicle? And he says, I've got no idea. Who did you lend the vehicle to? Has anyone else been in possession of the vehicle? All those type of questions. He had the opportunity to say, yes, I loaned it to a guy, I can't remember his name. He's a mate, he wanted to borrow it for a couple, but he didn't say that. He answered every question, gave an answer, but I had no doubt that he was telling lies, but we couldn't move him.
He admitted what he had to admit to us. He didn't volunteer any extra information other than what he thought we knew.
I was just convinced, I had that gut feeling that he was responsible for the disappearance of Amanda Carter.
Police closely looked at Hyland's movements from the time he had taken the fare to Windermere and then picked up the brown bag at the steps where Amanda Carter had been seen.
He said after that was when he finished duty, he had filled up his cab and then went to sleep at Windermere Beach.
But there were no witnesses to his sleeping arrangements that night. But he had been seen at the petrol station.
2 other taxi drivers saw Gerald Wayne Hyland, the cab driver, known as Wayne Hyland or Fatty Wayne, at the service station, and he appeared quite nervous and jumpy, and they asked him what was wrong. And at one stage he told another taxi driver to piss off.
Piss off!
This was about 3:30 a.m. and the station was only minutes from where Amanda Carter had last been seen at the taxi rank.
He was very much a very, very strong suspect.
Then on the 11th of September, late in the afternoon, I received a call to say that there had been a body found. It was a body of a young female, and it was strongly suspected that it may have been Mandy Carter.
The body was found here very late yesterday by a trout fisherman along the end of a dead-end road, Riverside Drive, which runs along the Derwent River. It's near Bridgewater, about 20 kilometres from the GPO where Mandy Carter was last seen alive 45 days ago. The position of the body was face down, and the area indicates that it would have been impossible for the body to have floated down the river. In other words, it's almost certain that she was dumped here.
At that stage, the tide was out and she was basically on a reasonably dry area. The hands were raised above her head like that, as if someone had actually pulled her along.
The body was partly undressed, which indicated perhaps to us that something had actually occurred sexually.
And at first light today, forensic scientists began their detailed examination. Police had to wait until the high tide before lifting the body out.
The body was taken up by the mortuary ambulance and conveyed to the mortuary of the Royal Hobart Hospital. When it was there, one of the family friends came in and did the identification, said, yes, this is the body of Amanda Carter.
We got a pathologist's report not long after that, and there was damage to the mouth, suggesting that somebody had punched Mandy in the mouth, and that probably rendered her unconscious, and an attempt had been made to strangle her.
But strangulation was not the cause of death. Amanda Carter had drowned. As she breathed in the waters of the Derwent River, tiny organisms called diatoms were also inhaled, and these were found in her internal organs at the autopsy. Was her drowning an accident or murder?
It seemed to me that there was a distinct possibility that her head had been forcefully held underwater because of the position of her hands.
But who had dragged her into that spot? As a routine, vaginal swabs were taken.
On examination of the slides, we found semen present. The most heaviest concentration was in the high vaginal area, and that's not surprising because she was face down with the tide coming in and out. The high vaginal area was protected from the water by the air pockets, and that's why we found some reasonable evidence.
But at this point in forensic technology, there wasn't enough sperm in the sample to do any testing, and they still didn't have blood from their main suspect to compare. So for now, detectives would have to rely on old-fashioned footwork to find the evidence they needed to put Wayne Highland at the crime scene.
As to anybody that they see in this area here, any cars I've seen going in there, any fishermen that they know do come here a lot, because it's a fair bet, because whoever dumped her here has got to know the area. We spoke to all the local people as to vehicles that were going up and down Riverside Drive, and we had a number of reports of cars in the area. We had some reports of taxis.
There was one report that a cab had been seen along there, and the description given by the person was that the driver had a head like a bastard pig, which I think fitted Highland quite well.
When Mandy Carter was last seen alive after going to a disco on July the 27th, she told friends she was going to take a taxi home.
Well, we at least know now in which direction the offender has taken her. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that she's been driven to this area.
We also did a lot of work with Highland's car, with the dirt that was found under the mudguard, and the best we could do was that it was similar to some of the red dirt that was up in that particular area, but unfortunately they couldn't say it is the same. And the grass was similar to some of the grasses that were in the general Bridgewater area, so we couldn't definitively say, yes, that grass or that dirt came from that area just north of Riverside Drive. It was frustrating because we were very keen on solving this through forensic science. We thought that forensics could tell us something. We thought that we would get something from that crime scene that would link us to Highland, but we didn't. The best we did from the crime scene was some of the witnesses that said that they saw a cab coming and going and a description of a person in a cab that generally fitted Highland.
So once again, police questioned him. But this time, they took him out to the crime scene.
He agreed to do this. He was very pleasant. The idea of taking him at night was to obviously catch him off guard.
We spoke to him there, and he, at that stage, said yes, he had been there.
He said, yes, I've been here quite often fishing, drove the taxi in this area, and, well, you've got to accept that because it's an area where you would go fishing and an area where you'd drive your taxi.
But he was adamant that he hadn't gone up there on the night in question, that he hadn't taken Mandy Carter, and I can't tell you any more about it than what I've told you the last 2 or 3 times you've interviewed me. We had a circumstantial case and I knew it. And I suspect that he knew it, and he wasn't giving too much away.
He didn't move. You prove it. If you think I did it, charge me.
He then claimed he was being harassed. I suppose to some extent he was, but I don't call it a harassment. It was an investigation and it had to continue.
And I remember saying to him, well, you want to get used to it, because there'll be more of these interviews. Because we made it quite clear to him that we had no doubt in our mind and in the minds of all the other detectives that he was responsible for the death of Amanda Carter.
8 months on, the inquest into Amanda's death was underway, with most of the attention focusing on the seminal stain in the back seat of the taxi.
The swab from the back seat of the taxi showed both Group A and Group B, but it was very difficult to allocate whether the female component was A and the male component was B, or whether the female component was B and the male component was A.
Blood from Amanda's body had been classified as Group A, but the red cells were broken down and the result was suspect.
To confirm that the sample result that we got from Amanda Carter was a true A, we then examined the blood from the family. We established within a reasonable probability that her blood group type was A.
So the A component on the back seat of the taxi could have been Amanda's. But was Wayne Highland's blood Group B?
Now, the problem we'd had all along was that Highland had refused to give us a sample of his blood. So we devised a bit of a plan after talking to John Presser, who said that he could get blood groupings from cigarette butts, saliva in cigarette butts.
I gave him a cigarette out of my own packet and watched what he did with the stub. And I got hold of the finished cigarette and put it into an exhibit bag, and from that, forensic people were able to determine his blood grouping from his saliva.
The conclusion was that his blood grouping was the same as one of the blood groupings that was in the seminal stain.
But that evidence was not available to the court. At the end of the proceedings, all that could be noted was that a female with blood group A had intercourse in that taxi. It didn't exclude Amanda, but it wasn't 100%.
I couldn't determine to the satisfaction of the magistrate that Amanda Carter had actually been in that taxi.
The coroner gave an open finding that the 22-year-old's death was by drowning caused by persons unknown.
So we basically put the evidence in the deep freeze and sat on it until we could find some better way of working out what the evidence could tell us.
We were somewhat despondent, I suppose. We hadn't solved the case. We all knew the family quite well. We'd constantly said to them, we'll solve this case. We think we know who did it and we'll solve it. But of course, at this point in time, we hadn't solved anything.
But in 12 years' time, things would be different, and Lupo Prinz and his antagonist would meet again. After a night out on the town, celebrating her birthday, Amanda Carter never made it home. 6 weeks later, her body was found dumped on the banks of the Derwent River. Police were convinced that Wayne Highland was responsible for her death. The stain on the back seat of his taxi indicated that Amanda might have been there, but it wasn't definitive.
We always worked on the theory that perhaps one day we would be able to analyse that material, and it might tell us a lot more than 2 blood groupings, which is what it was telling us in 1980. And we were hoping that somewhere along the line, Wayne Highland would make a mistake, or somebody would give him up, or something would happen.
That wish came true. 13 years after Amanda disappeared, there was a revolution in forensic science.
We became aware of something called DNA that had been applied in criminal cases in the UK, which was able to tell you a lot more than blood groupings. It was like a genetic fingerprint. That was very exciting for us because we thought that there may be a possibility it could yield a profile of possibly the people who were contributors to the seminal stain that we had.
Swabs from that stain and Amanda Carter's blood were now taken out of the deep freeze and sent to a scientist in Melbourne for testing. Could this cold case now be solved?
He got a result from the swab from the backseat of the taxi that showed that Amanda Carter contributed to that stain. And the probability that it is her is 1 in 140,000.
It meant that statistically speaking, there was a strong probability that her DNA was in the seminal stone. In other words, he was virtually putting her in the taxi.
This was really exciting stuff. I mean, you know, all these years have gone by, and we perhaps have got our man.
It was time to catch up with their favourite suspect, now living in Melbourne. He thought the local detectives brought him in to discuss some issues connected with a bogus charity scam he was involved in. Then Lupa Prinz entered the room.
He saw us and his face went quite grey, actually, and he was shaking, and I said, "Remember me?" As you're aware, I'm Superintendent Prinz. This is Detective Inspector Blue.
Been promoted since.
I have been promoted, yeah, a few times actually. And, after that, we exchanged pleasantries, I suppose you could say, and we put all the allegations to him once again. Could you have had intercourse with someone in the back seat of that taxi?
On that day, I've no idea.
About that time?
No, I don't remember.
Have you ever masturbated in the back seat of your taxi? The taxi that you had in 1980?
I don't recall.
Could you have done?
Possibly, I don't know. It's a long time ago, I've got no idea.
No, but I mean, you would know. I mean, I think most people would know whether they've masturbated in a car or not.
Oh, I really can't remember.
Did you assault Amanda Carter?
No, I didn't.
Did you kill Amanda Carter?
No, I didn't.
The forensic evidence was then put forward.
Forensic tests indicate that the stain contained a mixture of both sperm and vaginal fluid. Those tests indicate also that part of the stain is consistent with what we call the DNA profile of Amanda Carter. Can you offer any explanation for that?
No, I can't.
Are you quite sure that on no occasion that you had sex with Amanda Carter on the back seat of your taxi?
Positive.
Would you be prepared to provide a sample of your blood for scientific analysis?
I had the same question 10 years ago and I was told not to give it then, so I don't see why I should now. I don't know. I'd have to see a lawyer before I do anything about it.
Is there anything else, Mr. Holland, that you want to say about this particular investigation?
I've just about had enough of it. You haven't let up on me. As I said then, you hounded me. Looks like you're going to do it again. I had nothing to do with her going missing or a disappearance or a death or anything else. I understand the position you're in too, but I don't know why you've got to pick on me.
I think he was conscious then that the investigation was ongoing. I suppose he thought after going to 2 different states and 13 years down the track, he was a free man. He thought that the police wouldn't chase him anymore and he'd got far enough away, but the fact is he hadn't. At the end of the day, we charged him and we extradited him back to Tasmania. I rang Don Carter and I told him that the family were very relieved that finally, after all those years, that he'd been charged.
Once arrested, police finally had the authority to take a sample of Wayne Highland's blood. And there was no surprise. His DNA fingerprint was clearly seen in the compound stain from the back seat of his taxi.
Gerald Wayne Highland has pleaded not guilty to the murder of Amanda Carter on or about July 27, 1980. Crown Prosecutor Damien Bugg told the jury his case would involve evidence based on DNA testing far advanced to the forensic tests available at the time of the original investigations.
The trial proper began this week, but today it took an unexpected twist.
About 3 days into the trial, Damien Bugg rang me at home. I think his words were, "You've got him, mate, you finally got him." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Look, this is the situation. They've approached me and they're offering to plead guilty to manslaughter."
The murder charge was then read out again, and after hearing it, Highland said, "I'm not guilty of murder, but I am guilty of manslaughter." The Director of Public Prosecutions, Damien Bugg, told the court Highland tried to undress Miss Carter in the back of his taxi while she was dozing off.
The facts for the prosecution were that Highland had been working that night in his cab, that he'd gone to the CML cab stand, Amanda Carter was on the steps, that she probably got in the taxi and fell asleep. He got out of the taxi and picked up the handbag that was still sitting there where she was. He drove to North Hobart, and that's when he was seen by the other taxi drivers at the service station in North Hobart.
Piss off!
He then continued on out to Bridgewater, and he went to Riverside Drive. He then had sexual intercourse with her against her will. In other words, she was raped on the back seat of that taxi. After he committed the crime, he then tried to strangle Amanda Carter and may well have held her head underwater. And as a result of his acts, she died of drowning. And they pleaded guilty of those facts.
Wayne Highland was sentenced to 6 years for rape and 10 years for manslaughter.
A detective, when he becomes involved in a case which is so very personal as this one was, it becomes a part of you. And it was extremely satisfying that we had our man.
I've only spoken briefly to Mrs. Carter. Obviously, she's very relieved. She indicated she didn't want to speak to the media, but I'm sure the family are greatly relieved now that's all over and done with. Tragically, Don Carter died just before the trial, and he never got to know that Highland was convicted of the crime, so that was very sad. But for those of us that were there and were still working, it was a very satisfying result because we felt we'd honoured our commitment to the family.
But in 2001, 8 years into his 16-year sentence for the rape and manslaughter of 22-year-old Amanda Carter, Gerald Wayne Highland was granted parole.
Now, basically 8 years for a person's life is very poor in the sense of punishment. He's still wandering around right now. Amanda Carter's not.
The woman found wrapped in garbage bags on the side of this road had been the victim of a brutal murder. But there was no identification on her body. And like the name of the street where she was found, her identity would keep police guessing for many months to come.
When we arrived, the scene was very well contained by the local police who did an excellent job. It's a light industrial area, and it was very apparent because of the nature of the fact that she'd been wrapped in plastic and the body was dumped at the side of the road that this was a secondary crime scene and obviously not where she'd been killed.
The body was in the early stages of decomposition. The legs were bent at the knees with the feet beneath the buttocks. There was blood staining to her head and to the front of her top.
There was an obvious gash on the top of her head and we were aware that there was something in the mouth. It looked like paper, but at that stage it was really just a case of working out what was there. There was an obvious ligature around the throat.
The victim had short dark hair and a medium build. She was dressed in a white bodysuit and black and white shorts.
There is no other form of identification on her at all, apart from a gold wedding ring on her right hand and a black leather watch on her left wrist.
So there wasn't a lot at the scene that would actually help us in identification at that point. In fact, we did searches up and down the street and adjacent streets with the view of trying to find a purse or some identification that might have been dumped in concert with the body. Nothing transpired from those searches.
The body weighed 62 kilograms. She was 1.61 metres tall, about 5'1", 5'2". She looked fit, no needle track marks, no tattoos. In general terms, she looked like the person next door. It became obvious that neck compression was the most likely cause of death. There certainly was evidence of a blow to the head as well, but that probably only caused incapacitation, followed by the actual ligature strangulation. One of the things that was noted at the location was that there was the presence of a large amount of newspaper in her mouth. This obstructed her airway and it would have led to her suffocating.
The pathologist removed the newspaper from the deceased's mouth. and it was 2 full-size sheets of the Sydney Morning Herald dated the 10th of December 1991.
We were very conscious that this might be a valuable piece of evidence for us, and it was secured by the crime scene officers for fingerprint examination.
The date on the newspaper indicated that the victim had to have been murdered after that time. But the decomposition and maggots taken from her body suggested it was much sooner.
With the entomology, it actually gave us a window that actually was late in the evening of the 23rd of December and early in the morning on the 25th, which covers Christmas Day. You'd think if somebody is going to go missing in that time, that would be when you'd actually miss them. So we were fairly confident that we had a fairly straightforward murder. If we could identify this girl relatively quickly, we would then be able to identify the offender, because most people are actually killed by people that know them.
An autopsy has revealed the woman, aged in her mid-20s, was murdered 3 to 5 days ago. This watch offers the best hope for identifying the victim and solving the murder mystery.
It was really a case of putting it out to the media and then just waiting for the results to come in.
Police say it appears the young woman was murdered elsewhere.
As the nightly news pleaded for public help in the identification of the victim, the newspaper from her mouth was yielding its own results.
This slimy exhibit turned up one morning, a wad of newspaper the size of a man's fist that they removed from a throat. It was opened with gloved hands, and as it unfolded, right dead smack in the centre, we all spotted 3 fingerprint patterns. There were 3 distinct tips of fingers, one slightly higher than the rest. It was exciting. It was a fingerprint jackpot to us all. We believed that we might have had an unprecedented case. It looked like we might have the killer before we can even identify the victim.
Police were yet to identify the body of a woman who had been dumped in a suburban street. They were calling her Jane Doe. They believed that her killer had left behind a vital clue: 3 fingerprints that appeared to be in her blood on a newspaper stuffed in her throat.
I had one of those rare moments where you have this almost flashback of what would have happened during the commission of the crime, with the newspaper being pushed down into the mouth and leaving that fingerprint there.
First of all, we photographed the fingerprint in situ many times from different angles to capture everything we had. After that, we tried to enhance it with an enhydrant, which darkens it a little, and maybe we could pick up another ridge or 2. After that, the best fingerprint image that we have now of that left middle finger is then fed into the computer.
It just kept coming up as a blank. The suggestion was that this person hadn't been arrested previously, which is not unusual, because in most murder inquiries, usually the victim is killed by somebody they know, and often as not, those people don't come under the notice of police.
It was very disappointing, but our hopes were still high. We may identify the victim from another means. She must have lived somewhere. And the killer may not be on record now, but boy, he's going to come on record sooner or later with actions like that, isn't he?
What we had was the clothing she had, the injuries she sustained to her body, limited jewellery, some small amounts of hairs and sand that they'd found to the post-mortem. And that was about it at that stage.
I received some hair samples recovered from the victim's clothing, and when I looked at the sample, there seemed to be a lot of animal hairs present. And when I looked at these hairs under the microscope, I could then confirm they were animal hairs because their internal hair structure was different to the appearance of a human hair. The medulla, which is the central structure that runs through the hair strand, is much wider in an animal hair than a human hair. That was quite significant as far as I was concerned.
I had the inclination that there were dog hairs
And when I examined them under the microscope, obviously that was the proof that they clearly were dog hairs. It then was the matter of working out possibly what type of breed it could be. I declared eventually that the hairs came from an Alsatian or from a German Shepherd.
The reality was that we needed to identify, again, the victim, to identify the offender, to identify the dog, and that would actually be a piece of support evidence down the track. Because we had this sand on the body and the area is a beachside area, it struck us that it was a strong possibility she was a local. So we dressed up a policewoman in the same clothing, and she was approximately the same size, build and age, and we walked her down the beach and along various locations. We also took the store dummy down to a number of railway stations in a hope of actually attracting attention. The notion there was to actually appeal very much to that local area, to identifying the victim to the area. We also focused on the fact that there was a park down the road where a fairground had been set up. So we very quickly concentrated on that and also concentrated on the fairground staff as itinerants. She may have been somebody who worked at the fairground because they do attract itinerant workers, or alternatively she is a local that's actually visited the fair that day. So we looked at both possibilities when we went down there.
But there were no strong leads. With only the clothes she was wearing to spark a memory, it was difficult for the investigators to move forward.
We needed to make this girl come alive. We wanted people to actually empathise with her, and we wanted people to actually go out of their way to think about her. We set about very quickly designing ways to actually do that. We had a number of photographs from the morgue that we took. We looked at trying to digitally enhance the face. We took out all the insect infestation on the face. We actually then had to do some guesswork as to what her eyes would look like open.
We went through various hairstyles, some longer, some shorter, to align it with the face, then with the eyes, and then you get into a jawline, and then into skin colouring, because our girl had been in a state of decomposition.
I've got to admit, we actually did get a lot of very good results in terms of feedback from the community on it. Unfortunately, as with most things, it didn't get us the identification of the victim at that point. By this stage, I think we're up to about the second or third week, and I've got to admit that frustration levels at this stage were very high.
Since the discovery of the woman's body a month ago, police have been sifting through masses of missing person files, trying to make a positive identification.
My role was firstly to go through the hundreds of missing person reports that we had. I couldn't tell the figures nowadays, but the amount of girls that we went through just files, like hundreds and hundreds. So that was lengthy, but it was also good because we actually found girls that had been missing and got them to phone home to mum and dad. So that was one good thing to come out of it, but it didn't help us. There's still a family out there that somewhere have lost their daughter or wife.
With the Jane Doe story disappearing from the newspapers, a last-ditch effort was made with a magazine to help solve the murder mystery.
We had the advantage with the women's magazines of having these photos in colour. That would actually bring a dimension to the photographs that we hadn't had before in the newspapers. And in fact, we actually released a photo that was a three-quarter trunk shot, so that we actually had the clothing. And the notion was that those that actually had an interest in it would then say, yes, well, I now remember that top, because there's this link between that photograph and my memory of your sister, your cousin, your aunt, whatever the case may be. We got a call from a girl who claimed to know her.
And she actually then came into our office where she could view our photographs of what we had of the Seiko watch and also the ring and the clothing. She was pretty sure that it was her friend, Vivian. Not 100%, but 90% sure. She knew Vivian as a dancer at the King's Cross area in a number of the clubs up there. So we had a person saying, this is Vivian. What we needed was fingerprints of dental to say who it was.
And what we required was to obtain some material, preferably paper, cards, receipts, letters that she may have handled.
The witness had told police that Vivian had rented a place in King's Cross. From the lease, they now had her full name and fingerprints that matched those taken from the deceased at the autopsy.
Well, it just means she touched that piece of paper, but we still need positive identification. and the only way we had now was to obtain dental records. And those dental records were eventually obtained, and a dental comparison was carried out, and Vivian was positively identified.
Vivian Ruiz worked as a dancer, and she'd set her sights on going overseas, and to earn the money to go overseas, she did work as a prostitute, but she was quite ambitious not to do that into the future. The thing that had complicated the whole process to begin with was that Vivian had told a number of her friends that she'd planned to go overseas with her boyfriend over the Christmas period and travel Europe for several months. So these factors were the things that actually explained why we weren't able to identify Vivian as quickly as we'd liked.
Police identified the boyfriend as Richard White, whose name also appeared on the lease.
He was described as a person who was into bodybuilding. The witness believed he took steroids. He did take speed and amphetamine, and he dealt casually in amphetamine. From the descriptions, he was quite a massive fellow who was very much into the scene at King's Cross. She also described him as somebody who was probably free with his fists when dealing with Vivian if they'd had a fight.
So the mystery of Jane Doe's identity had been solved. But where was Richard White? More importantly, was it his fingerprint on the newspaper found in Vivian's throat? She had been known as Jane Doe for nearly 4 months. But then the murder victim, who had been found wrapped in plastic garbage bags, was identified as Vivian Ruiz, a dancer and part-time prostitute who was saving money to go overseas with her boyfriend.
They were quite active in the social scene at King's Cross, and at some stages they actually did have physical arguments when they were out, in that he would strike her or she would strike him. It was quite a volatile relationship sometimes when they were out socialising with their friends.
My understanding of the relationship between White and Ruiz was it was quite fiery, and that it was very much a hot and cold relationship. As I understand it, White actually had a preference for hanging around with prostitutes, and it turned him on talking about sex on a regular basis.
We knew that Vivian had spoken to her friends and had plans to travel with Richard over the Christmas period. So what we tried to find was, where are her tickets, where is her money gone? They've been working and she's been making lots of money according to her friends. There's got to be money, there's got to be tickets somewhere.
We found the travel agent up at King's Cross, where both Vivian and Richard had booked tickets for this overseas trip. Interestingly enough, Richard, on the 27th of December, had arranged for these tickets to be cancelled and for the money to be sent to his parents' place. That struck her as odd, the witness at the travel agent, because of the fact they'd paid for them separately and because there'd been this insistence on paying for them separately.
The 27th of December appeared to be a busy day for Richard. On that day, the first business day after Christmas, and the time police believed Vivian was murdered, Richard had visited his bank.
We were aware from our inquiries that Vivian had a shoebox that she collected her money in. She had a distrust of banks, as I understand it. And interestingly enough, Richard had banked a significant amount of money on the 27th of December, which we can't account for as to where he obtained that money. So I've got this name, Richard White. The first thing to do is to get on the computer to check to see if he's got a criminal history. Now that's unlikely, or at least at that stage I assumed it was unlikely, because we'd run this fingerprint through the system.
If Richard White did have a record, then his fingerprints should have popped up when the fingerprint found on the newspaper was fed into the police database.
But the record comes back showing that he's got a history of an assault and a drink driving matter. So I ring our fingerprint expert and we give him the name. And like I said, at this stage I'm a little bit curious as to why it hasn't come up if we've done the fingerprint checks before. I remember he said, look, leave it with me, and he went off to do the search, rang back and said, look, I've got some bad news, it's not him.
What we couldn't understand is we finally identified the girl, and hopefully it would all fall into place with the killer as well, with that fingerprint being on the newspaper. To be told that it wasn't a match was just like, how could it not be?
Cole said, look, there's something about this print that's not right. It looks like it should fit. You know, there are patterns in it that look like they actually are similar to what this fellow has as a fingerprint on record. So I said, look, leave it with me, I'll talk to somebody.
A gut instinct told detectives that Richard White was their man. So while the fingerprint section continued their examination of his prints, nothing was released to the public about Jane Doe's identity.
Well, we wanted to keep her identity out of the media at this stage simply because we didn't know where Richard White was. And there was a strong possibility that he could escape the net by going overseas to a country without extradition process for us. So we were very conscious of that, and we were also aware that they had planned a trip overseas, so he had the means to do that if he had not already travelled overseas. There was also the thinking that, look, if he had a co-offender and he had evidence still here that might convict him, it would be relatively easy to destroy it before we could actually get to it. So the notion was to identify his whereabouts and identify all the likely areas where there was evidence before actually making this public.
From the lease of Vivian's unit, we had Richard's full name and an address for him that we'd worked out from our inquiries that was his parents' home. What we needed to do was just speak to the parents, but you can't go out to someone and say, excuse me, is your son involved in a horrific murder? Michael thought the idea of just sending out one of the local traffic police to inquire if Richard was around in relation to a traffic incident. Just keeping it nice and innocent, that way you're not going to alert Richard if he does need to be spoken to by us.
Officer, yes. Mrs. White, is it?
The traffic sergeant did a really good job in establishing that Richard had in fact left the country on the 2nd of January and had flown to Bangkok. Probably the other significant thing that the traffic sergeant was able to tell us is that the family actually had a German Shepherd. So we had a couple of pieces of evidence there that we could see starting to fall into place.
Beautiful dog.
From the inquiries that the local police officer did for us going to the parents' house, we found out that Richard had a vehicle or a van that he'd sold. So then we knew a van that we then had to track down to see when he'd sold it, was it used around Christmas, and is it of any purpose to our investigation.
We were extremely lucky in that the new owner had never washed the van and had not cleaned out what was an old carpet that he'd kept in the back. It had a stain on it, but it had been treated in some fashion with chemicals, thinners or some other item from Richard's French polishing trade. It looked very deliberate that he disguised this spill by pouring a chemical over it.
It indicated that something had been trying to be covered up. It's like whitewashing graffiti off a wall.
The crime scene investigator observed that on the underside of the mat there were some areas where there was underfelt. And in one of those areas he saw a dark stain which appeared to be blood. He also examined the gearbox cover in the vehicle and observed dark brown staining to that area. He carried out a presumptive test for blood on that stain which gave a very quick positive reaction.
So we were pretty confident we'd found the vehicle that had actually transported that body. I might add too that the van and the carpet still had trace hairs from a German Shepherd.
But there was still the question of the fingerprint. In most homicides, the victim knows their killer. When Jane Doe was identified as Vivian Ruiz, the obvious suspect was her sparring partner and boyfriend, Richard White. It was a surprise then that his fingerprints didn't match those on the newspaper stuffed down her throat. But the detectives weren't giving up, nor were the fingerprint experts.
He brought it to me and we checked it together and I said, pictorially, it's a perfect J-loop, absolute match. Go back and reverse it.
What Barry Fay was asking for was a negative image to be made of Richard White's fingerprint. And when it was done, it perfectly fitted the fingerprint found on the newspaper.
We call it a tonal reverse. It's not the ridges that we're looking at here, we're looking at the valleys. So the fingerprint black lines were in fact the grooves between each papillary ridge. And when we first saw those 3 blood-like fingerprints on the newspaper, we theorised that the killer has blood all over his hands. He finds the newspaper nearby and grabs at it. The grabbing action takes all the blood off the tops of the ridges, but the valleys in between are still damp. And then he starts pushing it down her throat. He makes that last desperate thrust with those 3 fingers to get it as far down her throat as he can. The valleys of the fingerprint come forward now under pressure and transfer the fingerprint pattern. Then as he pulls his hand out, the paper closes around it, and he may have then finished the wad off with 2 hands to make sure.
It was a 1 in a million forensic phenomenon, and a call went straight through to the hard-working detectives.
It was pretty good because we'd done so much work, and to finally get a match of who she was, then the boyfriend, and then to say there's a fingerprint and it's a match, it was just fantastic. It was the best thing we've had in months. So we could then go on to our next stages of finding him. From the inquiries with the immigration department, we knew that Richard had left the country and gone via Bangkok under his own name and passport.
And White had actually booked his tickets to travel overseas on the 31st of December, which was the first business date that he could have booked the tickets after the body was located. At that point, we'd been able to establish that Richard had travelled via the Philippines and had gone to England, but where, we weren't sure.
Richard White's movements on leaving Australia had been tracked, and police were confident he was now in the United Kingdom. But to continue their hunt, police would need to call on the help of their British counterparts at Scotland Yard.
We received a fax from the Australian High Commission in London asking for assistance to trace a Richard White who was suspected of murdering a female called Vivian Ruiz in Sydney in December 1991.
And how long are you going to be away for?
We managed to do a check on the phone records of the White family in Bexley. There were a number of reverse charges phone calls to England, and we provided the Metropolitan Police with those phone numbers, most of which came to phone boxes in the southwest of England, but there was a phone number there for Newcastle, and we established this was actually an uncle's address.
We just couldn't knock on the door. So we then made a few inquiries around bars. We found that White used to like to go to clubs and bars, so we went round and made a few inquiries there. And I actually showed a photograph of White to a barmaid, and she says, he's Australian, isn't he? And then I was sure he was definitely there. So I came up with the idea that we'd put a phone call into White's aunts and uncles. And I got this rather husky-voiced lady detective to ring up and ask, is Richard there? And said, yeah, I'm Richard. So immediately we're in through the door, and he's standing near the fireplace with a phone in his hand, and I go up to him and tell him I've got a warrant here that's been issued by Bow Street Magistrates Court at the request of the Australian government for the murder of Vivian Ruiz. His reaction was total surprise. He said, what's happened to Vivian? I don't know anything about a murder. You can't look me up.
Well, we got the phone call to say that Richard had been arrested. There was a fair bit of elation in the office and some relief. But oddly enough, this is actually when the hard work actually starts.
The detectives needed to find further and solid proof that linked Richard White to the murder if they were to extradite him to Australia to face charges.
Basically, you need to provide almost the brief that you provide for court. It's got to be of a standard in which you can actually prove a prima facie case to the English authorities of murder.
Detective Sergeant Pateki asked me, look, as soon as you apprehend White, we want to go round to the parents' house and do a forensic examination of certain aspects of that house to see if Vivian's body was there at any time.
We drove out to Bexley and executed the warrant immediately. We knew that White had a capacity to make a phone call, and they could only delay that phone call for a short period, so we wanted to have the warrant executed and the premises secured before that phone call could be made.
Knocking on someone's door in the middle of the night saying we've got a search warrant to search your house in relation to a murder investigation isn't a pleasant thing to do to anyone. Richard's parents were quite accommodating, allowing us in, allowing our crime scene fellow to come in.
I was actually struck by the parents. They were very decent people. They both actually asked the obvious question, what's it for? And when I told them it was to do with the murder of his girlfriend Vivian Ruiz, they both broke down and cried. I felt quite uncomfortable about the fact that, you know, we had distressed them, but the The reality was we had a job to do.
While the crime scene examiners looked for the evidence they needed, Richard White was in a cell in London preparing his own case.
There were some notes that he made. Don't talk to the police. Don't be tricked by the police. And I think the last point was don't fuck up.
Police are seeking the extradition of a man charged with murdering the mysterious Sydney woman known, until now, as Jane Doe.
In their determination to identify the victim, police exhibited a mannequin and circulated a computer-enhanced photo of the woman's face. After 4 months of exhaustive inquiries, a Sydney prostitute would finally recognise the victim as 22-year-old Vivian Linda Ruiz.
Known on the streets as Linda, Vivian had been working at King's Cross for more than 6 months as a stripper at various establishments, including the well-known Porky's night spot.
Real good sort. That's the only way I could put it. Real good sort of pleasant girl.
White appeared in court today in the same clothes he was arrested in more than a week ago. The court was told police had denied him access to his clothing, cash and other belongings. A Scotland Yard detective said the clothes could not be handed over. They'd have to go to Sydney for forensic testing.
During that search, we found what I would describe as a ligature, a cord, which was knotted at both ends. It was about 36 inches long. We bagged that up for the attention of the Australian authorities.
Authorities here are still waiting for evidence from Sydney police to proceed with the case against White. Sydney detectives will have to prove a case against him if he's to be extradited to face the charge of murdering King's Cross stripper Vivian Ruiz.
While detectives on different sides of the world worked on her case, Vivian Ruiz was finally cremated 5 months after her death. Sadly, cemetery staff outnumbered the mourners. But Vivian's memory would soon be honoured by detectives determined to convict her killer.
The search warrant actually revealed a number of interesting things. The house itself is built onto a slope, so there's a workroom underneath. And the workroom was fairly clearly where Richard used to do his French polishing.
And it was during the search of that workshop area that a German Shepherd walked through. We knew that there were some dog hairs had been found on Vivian's body. The crime scene fellow at the time, with my assistance, obtained some hairs from the dog.
When the police the second time round came with hair samples of a dog, which was a German Shepherd dog, they wanted me to have a look at those hairs and see whether they're identical to the hairs that I've identified, and they looked exactly the same. I felt sure, actually, that they would have come from the same dog.
Sand had also been found on the victim's bodysuit when she was brought into the morgue.
Where the storage room finished, there was a void area that was quite sandy. We noticed that it had been covered quite significantly in lime, which suggested that that might have been where the body, in fact, had been stored for a period.
And also of interest was some evidence of mummification.
There was a drying out at the end of the fingers, which suggested that she'd been stored somewhere, and that particular location would have been dry, it would have been well aired. Because we're talking about the middle of summer here, so, you know, it would have been somewhere where this body could have actually been left without attracting a lot of attention.
In that same area, a number of boxes were piled up. Boxes that contained personal items of Vivian Ruiz.
In Richard's room, there were a number of Vivian's items which would not be explained had they had a break-up, as he had told a number of friends and she'd gone overseas without him. One of our key witnesses was an associate of both Richard and Vivian, and he'd bumped into Richard on New Year's Eve, shortly after the murder, and in fact had asked Richard where Vivian was because he was a mutual friend of both. The interesting thing was that Richard made a point of saying very specifically that they'd both broken up, that he had cashed in his ticket to go overseas and that Vivian was still planning to go overseas without him. So it didn't make sense that he should leave these items there, and certainly it suggested that he was actually building an alibi and building a story to all his friends that Vivian had gone overseas, and therefore it was not untoward to see that she was missing.
Police are confident the man charged over Sydney's so-called Jane Doe murder will be extradited from Britain within a fortnight. White's solicitor has just returned after visiting her client and says he now wants to come home.
He's quite keen that he wants to clear his name.
The detectives then headed to London.
We went to the watch house and there was a search of the material that he had on him. There was a whole set of notes basically addressed to himself about things he needed to say and things he needed to cover. And there was one note headed, "Do this now," and the first point was, "Convince yourself of your innocence."
In a way, sort of saying that he's guilty because convince yourself of your innocence. If you're innocent, you don't have to convince yourself.
Then went on with a series of points underneath, which included contact your business associates and friends, convince them of your innocence. Don't talk to the police. Don't be tricked by the police. And I think the last point was don't fuck up. He then went on in another series of notes to actually have what appeared to be a mock interview. They'd had things like a question, "Why did I hit her?" Then a series of answers after it. And it appeared to me that he very clearly at this point was trying to actually work out, okay, well, what's a valid story I can put to the court that they'll believe that says I didn't kill her?
The reason for those notes appeared to be as a result of a conversation he had with Detective Bowen on the flight from Newcastle to London just after his arrest.
Richard White said, "I have to fight this." She told me on Christmas Eve that she was a prostitute. I just thought she was a dancer. She told me that she couldn't come to my parents' place. We had a fight. I felt so stupid. It's not as bad as they say.
Yet other of his notes and statements from friends of the couple were in complete contradiction to this account.
When Les tells me about this, clearly, we've actually got to really nut down this relationship in terms of what people understood their relationship was. And it was fairly clear that the picture was that a number of people knew that Richard and Vivian were in a relationship where he knew she was a prostitute and was turned on by it. I think it clearly demonstrates that this guy has a degree of cunning. He's clearly running a line that, she's a prostitute, and that opens a door for him in terms of actually explaining why she's been killed. That may, allow him to find an excuse that exonerates him.
Richard George White arrived back in Australia under police guard last night following lengthy extradition proceedings in Britain. Today, Central Local Court was told Ms Ruiz died from strangulation and suffocation sometime on December 24, 3 days before her body was found wrapped in plastic garbage bags. Police indicated their case against White would feature detailed scientific evidence, including the allegation his fingerprint was found on the newspaper stuffed in the victim's throat and that her blood was found in the car he sold before leaving for England.
But the case for the defence was about to throw a spanner in the works. It may be Richard's print, but not Vivian's blood. It was a theory that could set Richard White free. Two years after Vivian Ruiz was murdered, the police felt they had a strong brief of evidence to present at Richard White's committal. But it wasn't a fait accompli.
In a court situation, it can twist and turn and technicalities arise and we lose cases. Fingerprints have lost a lot of cases.
But in this case, it wasn't the fingerprint that was going to be questioned, but how it got there. His defence team believed that Richard, more so his fingerprint, had accidentally been caught up in the murder, and he was never there.
We were always convinced that the fingerprint was our key item of evidence. It was everything else hinged around that. But because we had such a small sample on the newspaper, we couldn't submit it for any further testing in terms of confirming whether it was blood or not.
It was critical evidence for the fingerprint people. Till we got the clearest possible image, we didn't even touch it with a chemical, let alone test it for blood.
Once fingerprinting was completed, they then sent the newspaper to me, so I just tested the prints with a screening test for blood. This is a catalytic test, and it isn't specific for blood, but it will give a good indication if blood is present. And I got a positive reaction for the prints.
But the test will show positive for anything that is protein-based, like meat. It was a fact that the defence was eager to act on.
And during the course of a cross-examination of Barry Fay, the defence made this very strong suggestion that said that, look, their client could simply have been the victim of circumstance.
She theorised that perhaps her client could have been eating a meat pie with tomato sauce on it at the time that fingerprint was placed on the newspaper.
He's eating that pie with sauce while reading a newspaper. He's left a print on the newspaper. And that at some point down the track, quite independent from him, the real offender has come in, killed Vivian Ruiz, picked up this newspaper, screwed it up, forced it down her throat, and incriminated their client by the fact that they've left this pie sauce fingerprint in the newspaper.
And then Detective Platecki saved the day by rushing off and getting a copy of that newspaper, and we found that if that was the case, it was a meat pie, then he had to be reading the newspaper upside down.
It was fairly clear the defence didn't have a response for this and actually hadn't thought with any clarity about where this fingerprint was actually found. And then Barry went on to sort of hammer home the nail by actually saying it's not just a case of, you know, touching the paper. This is substantial force.
The pressure of that last thrust transferred the valleys onto the paper, and the closing up of the jaw sealed it off for all time.
And I think that's the compelling argument on which the rest of the brief hangs, is that the person who scrunches up that paper must have been the person who leaves that print there.
That put his hand down her throat. Why do you put your hand down someone's throat? The average layman's going to be thinking, well, to kill someone.
As soon as that point was made in that committal, I knew at the trial we would have this matter dusted.
There was enough circumstance in our mind to bring a jury to a guilty conviction.
After 4 years, an international hunt and some meticulous forensic work, the mystery of the Jane Doe murder has finally been solved. A Sydney man was today convicted of killing prostitute Vivian Ruiz, the real identity of the victim.
Judge Hidden said White's admissions to British police on his arrest and his fingerprint on newspaper found down the victim's throat left no doubt he was the killer.
The judge found White had killed his girlfriend in a fit of passion, but just what triggered the gruesome attack will probably never be known.
There are obviously unresolved issues, and they happen in every murder inquiry. And in this one of the unresolved issues is where was she murdered? We also really haven't nutted out the motive. While I have a theory that I believe that the steroids and the speed abuse contributed to this murder, I think there's a degree of premeditation in it. I think that he was contemplating this notion of actually getting rid of her for some time, based on the fact that he's taken the money, which is a very conscious act. But the fact is we don't know for sure, and the only person who can tell us is White. My belief is Richards probably hit her with a stunning blow to the back of the head and then strangled her. Chances are he thought she's alive and finished her off by shoving this newspaper down her throat. I suspect, based on the fact there's lime under the parents' household, that he's actually placed the body up in a very cool area. He has probably left it there for a short period over the Christmas break, wrapped the body up in plastic, taken it out, and put it in the van. It was certainly the case we could say there were trace elements of blood on the differential cover in the back cargo area of that van, which would suggest this was a vehicle used to transport Vivian to Guess Avenue where the body was dumped.
Richard White was sentenced to 15 years, with a minimum of 10 for murdering his girlfriend, Vivian Ruiz. He is still serving time.
I was quite pleased and quite proud that we're involved in this process because it had been a lot of investment, both emotionally and professionally. And I think the key thing for any cop is that you're joined to make a difference. And when you look at this case, it could be one that is still sitting on the shelf if we hadn't have actually pushed it that little bit.
The Jane Doe murder mystery will stay in the annals of the fingerprint science in New South Wales for 1,000 years. It'll be referred to over and over whenever a tonal reverse comes about, and it'll happen again and again.
Kathleen Marshall's murder investigation would be dominated by rumours, catfights and psychic consultations. Everyone had their view on who killed Kathleen, but it was the forensics that would separate the fact from fiction in this very bizarre case.
Kathleen! Kathleen!
I arrived at Kathleen's house and Glenda and Robert and Sandra were standing on the front steps.
This is strange, isn't it?
They'd been knocking on the door, calling out to Kathleen.
She's just not answering.
I'll go and get the key.
And I was starting to get a bit concerned that maybe she'd had a stroke or something like this. Glenda came running up the side, calling out, "Robert, Robert, are you there? There's flies, blood and a smell." And we went up to Kathleen's surgery. The smell, it was obviously the smell of something that was dead in the surgery. We didn't know what to think, but yet you could see the outline of one arm. And we didn't want to face the fact that it was Kathleen who was dead in the surgery.
The grisly scene was discovered late this afternoon. Friends of the woman arrived for a meeting, but no one responded. Then one of the group noticed blood on an outside door. They looked through a window and found more blood on the floor.
Our initial observations were focused upon the entry to the surgery. The surgery door was stained in blood. On the exterior side of the front door, there were swipe marks associated with the door lock. There was blood also on a mat, and there were spatter patterns of blood on the vegetation to the left-hand side of the doorway.
The deceased's body was located with her head towards the front right-hand corner of the surgery, with her legs pointing on a diagonal back towards the back left-hand corner. Her dress was blood-soaked, and there was a large amount of blood around the deceased.
With a large amount of blood present on the floor of the surgery, we used crime scene steps to enable us to walk through the scene without contaminating the blood upon the floor. There was a lot of dilute blood staining around the sink, both within the sink, on the taps, and more importantly, associated with a plastic bag on the left-hand side of the sink. Beneath the sink, a bucket contained a blood-stained Chuck's wipe. Now, it indicated to us that a very poor attempt had been made to clean the area. Now, whether that was an attempt to clean the blood of the body of the deceased or to clean blood perhaps left behind by the perpetrator.
The body had a number of what appeared to me to be stab or incision wounds. There was a large number had been through clothing and the brassiere as well.
In fact, the 54-year-old vet, who lived alone with her 22 cats and 2 dogs, had been stabbed more than 50 times.
Due to the sheer amount of stab and incision wounds, it was obviously identified that it was a crime of passion, that this wasn't just an opportunist, this was someone who had a real problem with the deceased.
Police say she'd been stabbed repeatedly. She'd died as she'd lived, fighting to the end.
It seems as though, from the injuries, that it was a frenzied attack and that the deceased has tried to defend herself.
There was physical evidence of a scuffle within the surgery. There was a section of louver windows which had shattered, and the glass from those windows had fallen into the garage on the other side. That suggested to us that there was a scuffle within the surgery, and a person or persons have come in contact with the glass window and perhaps may have suffered injuries as a result. And our hopes were relying upon that person doing that and us discovering the blood at the scene.
As crime scene investigators collected blood samples in the hope that the killer had been injured in the struggle, they were alerted to some blood-stained clothes found only minutes away.
In the initial stages of the investigation, a mail bag, which contained bloodied shoes, arrived at the Northgate Mail Centre. The collection of that mail bag also indicated it was collected within certain hours, a number of hours prior to the body being located. That was obviously an area of investigation that we had to follow.
Well, we conducted a search of a number of post boxes within the area. We came across the post box and the inside was blood stained. We observed a trail of blood leading from the post box. Our thoughts were that an offender perhaps had discarded his clothing or her clothing within the post box to conceal the crime.
But was the blood on those items Kathleen Marshall's? And if so, whose clothes were they? Brisbane vet Kathleen Marshall had been found stabbed to death in her surgery, and police believed they were on the trail of her killer. In a post box just a short distance away, they'd found discarded bloody clothing.
Scientific attended that scene of that mailbox and conducted investigations there and took blood samples, etc. But we were able to identify very quickly that the blood trail led to a smashed window where a store had been broken into. Also led to a phone box next to the mailbox. We were able to trace the phone calls from that phone box to the Queensland Ambulance Service, who had collected a patient from that location who was suffering a deep cut to his legs. That person was quickly identified, still in the Royal Brisbane Hospital, was interviewed and subsequently charged with offences not related to this matter.
But the police knew that it was likely that the killer had left his calling card in the surgery. 25 samples of blood spattered throughout the crime scene had been collected for forensic testing in hope of finding the killer's DNA and his or her identity. Meanwhile, detectives were upstairs, discovering further evidence.
Kathleen Marshall was a lover of music. In the main lounge area, she had a piano. During the course of searching around the residence, I noticed that sheet music was open on the piano. Upon looking at it further, I noticed that it was a death march. And I thought this was very strange. Had someone been upstairs and turned it specifically to those pages?
Kathleen's house certainly gave detectives the impression that was the case.
The residence was messed up, in a dishevelled state, with newspapers on the floor, bed was messed up. But it wasn't until through further investigations that we identified that this was the way that the deceased conducted her normal business.
Late today, the animals she'd sheltered were being removed from her home while SES volunteers combed the neighbourhood for a possible weapon or clues. Police want to hear from anyone who can help them piece together Kathleen Marshall's last movements on the weekend.
In the property of Kathleen Marshall, we discovered a small personal diary which had identified certain appointments that she had for the Thursday. There was an appointment at 12:30 for a gentleman with his dog, obviously a veterinary appointment, and at 1 o'clock there was an appointment for a gentleman with a cat. The appointment for the man with the dog, it actually gave his full name, and he was able to tell us that as he left, he remembered seeing an old couple arrive.
And I saw a man walking down the road towards Kathleen's place, and he had a Siamese seal point cat. The ears stand out. He was holding it like so, you know, with the cat there. Oh, they said to Kathleen, oh, this looks like your 1 o'clock appointment. And she said, oh, probably it would be.
Away we went, and that was the last I think, we ever saw of Kathleen Marshall.
So during the door knocks, one of the areas that we were looking at was that anyone had a Siamese cat, and we couldn't identify that person.
As police continued their quest to find John Wilson and others who saw Kathleen Marshall during the last few days of her life, her answering machine was providing a vital clue in determining the time of death.
Have you gone away, Kath? I'm trying to get hold of
you reporting our concert tonight, so do give us a ring.
We were able to ascertain from listening to her recorded messages on her answering machine that she did not return any telephone calls post 6 p.m. on a Thursday, and she did not answer the phone from that period onwards.
Kath, I still haven't heard from you, honey. Look, I'll wait till about 5 o'clock, and if you don't call me, I'll presume you're not coming.
It appeared that Kathleen had been murdered sometime after 6 p.m. that Thursday night. Cartons of milk and newspapers delivered from the Friday onward remained in her front yard.
Report was received from the forensic entomologist, which estimated the time of death at somewhere between 9 p.m. on Thursday the 26th of February and 3 a.m. the following morning.
So who had the time, opportunity and reason to kill Kathleen?
My first thought when I discovered she'd been murdered was that it would be involved with the Cat Protection Society of Queensland in some way.
Kathleen Marshall was the president of that society, a position that wasn't supported by all of its members.
How would you describe the Cat Protection Society?
Off the planet. There was no dealing with them. They were just totally fanatical.
What has emerged is a story of feline fanatics engaged in bitter brawling.
Do you think these very passionate feelings within the society could have led someone to murder?
Yes. Quite frankly, yes.
The Cat Protection Society of Queensland was larger than I had ever imagined. There was quite a lot of money coming in from bequests, from wills. Most of the money came from wills.
There was quite a bit of money. There were 2 bequests coming through. The biggest one, I think, was $350,000.
I know that from talking to members of the society, there have been some years of friction in relation to the spending of the finances and how the money had been spent, who'd be getting what.
There was 2 distinct camps. You were either in Kathleen Marshall's camp or you were in Virginia Houston's camp. There was no in between.
Virginia Houston was a former director and treasurer of the society, and according to her, she'd been unceremoniously and unfairly dumped.
Virginia seemed to think that the society was her baby. And I believe she was completely devastated that she was actually removed from the board.
If you're investigating any crime, obviously motive becomes a very strong indicator as to who may have committed the crime. And at that stage, for want of motive, we had a disagreement, a known disagreement between 2 people who were members of the Cat Protection Society of Queensland, one being Kathleen Marshall and one being Virginia Houston. They were at loggerheads.
Literally. 6 weeks before her death, Virginia had barged into Kathleen's home, which was the registered office of the Cat Protection Society.
Kathleen told them to get out, that they couldn't come in. Virginia said, it's the registered office, it's my right to come in. Kathleen rang 000 on the phone, asked the police to come. She said there's a mad woman in the house.
There was no doubt who Rhoda and her friends believed killed Kathleen, right from day one.
Just before the crime squad arrived, this car drove past and it was Virginia. I was horrified. I just gasped. The police officer came up to us and said, what's wrong? And Glenda said, oh, the murderer's just driven past.
But was Virginia Houston's hatred of Kathleen that strong that she would commit murder?
I do recall that in a conversation with the pathologist, he did say due to the nature of the injuries and the fact that they were so shallow in the way of the stab wounds, he said it would suggest either a weak person or it could have been a female.
Kathleen Marshall, the president of the Cat Protection Society, had been fighting bitterly with Virginia Houston just weeks before her murder. Police believed Virginia had the motive and the passion to kill Kathleen.
She's been a key murder suspect, but Virginia Houston isn't in hiding and isn't hindering police inquiries.
I've done nothing, I've got nothing to hide, so I'm quite happy to talk to the police whenever they want to talk to me.
I remember it was on the Friday that we interviewed Virginia Houston. We collected her in the morning from her house and we conducted an interview at the Nunda CIB, which lasted all day.
I said I had a lot of information, and I did. I had a lot of information about the society, about the inside knowledge of the society, and as a good citizen, I wanted to help the police.
Virginia quite openly suggested that she had animosity towards Kathleen Marshall, didn't try and deny it, didn't try and deny that she was having problems with the other board members of the Cap Protection Society of Queensland. She didn't deny the fact that she had been round to Kathleen Marshall's house and obtained entry into her residence against Kathleen's will.
I mean, the police seem to have this idea of hate, but I've never hated anyone in my life. I just liked the way she behaved, the way she treated people. As for being violent, well, that was just wasn't part of me.
She was confident in her manner. She knew the types of questions that we would ask, and she had almost prepared responses to our questions.
She was asked directly if she had killed Kathleen Marshall.
Jeff Marsh turned round to me and said, "Did you murder her?" And I was just stunned. And that was when I realised that they were looking at me as well. I couldn't believe it. And I'm just sitting there shaking my head, you know, I can't believe this, I can't believe this. So I just said, no, I've done nothing. You know, just like in disbelief, you know, disbelief that anyone could even ask me such a question, you know. He was somebody who totally law-abiding, never had so much as anything more than a parking fine.
At the conclusion of the interview, I was not prepared to say that Virginia was not involved at that time and that some of the issues that she had raised and versions that she had provided required further investigation.
We had a search warrant for Virginia Houston's house, and her house was searched.
And I said, well, you don't need a search warrant. I said, you can search my house, you can, you know, take my fingerprints, whatever, you know.
Ms Houston admits to having a heated argument with Dr Marshall just weeks before her death, and police have now questioned her and searched her house and car.
We were looking for physical evidence such as blood, hairs and fibres, and more importantly, the weapon used to commit the offence.
And to have police raids and SES people going through your property trying to find a knife or something, you know. You're just in shock. You just go around in shock. You just can't believe something like this is happening.
But no weapon was found. And while the spraying of luminol to detect any traces of blood looked promising, the lab results returned the samples as negative.
There was no evidence obtained from that residence to suggest any connection with the murder of Kathleen Marshall.
But Virginia Houston remained a strong suspect, and her alibis were being checked, starting with her tarot card reader, Patrick Hanrahan.
The members of the Cap Protection Society of Queensland and associates of Kathleen Marshall and associates of Virginia Houston were involved, actively involved, in the psychic readings and the spirit world. When I first went to interview Patrick Hanrahan, he refused to talk to me unless he could read my cards to find out whether I was a person suitable to be spoken to. And that was quite bizarre because those areas were foreign to myself and all the other investigators on the case. I had to find someone from the office who was prepared to come with me and not break out in laughter. And so it was pretty frustrating, but I found someone who came along and they were able to contain their laughter until after I'd obtained the information from Patrick. Because we had to get him, we had to get information from him. He was the alibi for Virginia Houston up until 4 p.m.
And you can do healing, hands-on healing.
He confirmed initially that he was with Virginia all afternoon doing a reading, and then at 4 o'clock Virginia dropped him at a medical appointment and he hadn't seen her since then.
Virginia's alibis were checking out, but police wanted to re-interview a woman who said she was with Virginia on the night they believed Kathleen Marshall was murdered.
Corinne Welsh is the lady who provided the, you might say, alibi, for want of a better word, from 5 p.m. until 11 p.m. on the Thursday night. Obviously a very critical time period in the investigation.
According to Corinne Welsh, the two women had spent that time doing a mail-out for the society. Now, in her second meeting with police, her recollection changed.
And it was during that interview she gave us further information to suggest that Virginia was not with her the entire evening.
When Kathleen Marshall was murdered, her friends and colleagues pointed to one person as being the killer, Virginia Houston. Virginia had fought with Kathleen in the past and readily admitted there was no love lost between them.
I disliked the way she behaved, the way she treated people, but as for being violent, well, that was just wasn't part of me.
Virginia had given alibis for the time period that police believed Kathleen Marshall was murdered, but it now appeared one had holes in it.
Re-interviewing everyone that supplied information in relation to the movements of Virginia Houston in the week prior to Kathleen Marshall's body being located. We were in the process of re-interviewing Corinne Welsh, who was an integral part of an alibi, for want of a better word, of Virginia Houston for the Thursday night, the 26th of February. And it was during that interview she gave us further information to suggest that Virginia was not with her the entire evening.
It was the first solid lead detectives had in their case against Virginia Houston, but it wouldn't go very far. A phone call from the forensic laboratory would change the entire direction of the investigation.
Whilst we were interviewing Corinne Welsh and we'd established that time frame, or that time gap, Ken Cox rang the office and told us that there was male blood at the crime scene.
5 of the 25 blood samples from the veterinary surgery, including blood found on the cardboard below the shattered louver window, had yielded DNA that wasn't Kathleen's, nor Virginia Houston's, but that of a male.
It was rather exciting news to find male blood, but until we link it to somebody, it's of no value. All we're looking for in the early proceedings is male blood with an unknown name attached to it.
I thought, well, at least it gives us our investigation a direction to follow now. We have to find a male person who is linked to the deceased in some way, and we had a target. At least we had a target.
Police now believe Dr. Marshall was murdered by a male, and that detectives have taken blood from several men connected to the society.
As it was male DNA, all men who knew Kathleen were required to give a blood sample, including me, for DNA testing.
During this DNA exclusion process, there were approximately 42 persons identified. This was obviously time and labour intensive.
In those days we had to take blood. It was in the initial stages of DNA sampling.
The blood samples collected from Dr. Marshall's associates will be matched with the results of blood and tissue taken from the murder scene.
On the consent form, you had to admit that you're a suspect. The way the consent form was written is, I admit I'm a suspect in the murder of Kathleen Francis Marshall, and I hereby give consent for police to take my blood, hair samples, all that sort of thing. That can be a bit confronting to someone who has no involvement at all in the matter and really is only a distant link to Kathleen Marshall.
Of course, I was under the suspicion that we were all suspects at first, but we later found out it was to eliminate people from being suspects.
When I was asked to give DNA, I realised the last thing you should do is refuse, because that never looks good. And if you give it and everything is kosher and they can come up with the right answer, it means you're in the clear.
In fact, the 42 males tested were all clear. And now police were targeting the men in Virginia Houston's life. One was her ex-boyfriend.
We found that gentleman at a boarding house in the Fortitude Valley area, and his DNA was requested, and he refused to give his DNA. Now, the detectives at the time had the foresight to observe his movements for a period of time after he declined the DNA sample, and they identified him spitting on the ground. They then captured his DNA from the spit on the ground. So that DNA was taken away. He was still at the boarding house. It'd be a matter of days. We'd be able to either exclude him or say it's him. The very next morning, the boarding house owner had rung us and said that he's just hopped in a taxi cab with his bags packed. We made some investigation and identified that that cab was going to the transit centre, went across to the transit centre and located this gentleman who'd purchased a ticket under a false name from Brisbane to Sydney. So he obviously becomes a person that now is at the top of the list and very much a person of interest in this investigation. He's male, he knows Virginia Houston, he won't give DNA, and he's trying to leave the state.
Brisbane vet Kathleen Marshall had been brutally murdered in her surgery. Virginia Houston had been the prime suspect until investigators discovered male blood at the crime scene. Now they were on the trail of one of Virginia's ex-boyfriends, who had refused to give a DNA sample.
We then take him into custody, interview him, and after a short amount of time he volunteers his DNA, his fingerprints, his clothes and his bag. And he said, you can test it all, there'll be no blood on it. I'm not involved in this crime in any way, shape or form. Unfortunately, the DNA that came back from he did not match the crime scene, and there was nothing on the clothes to indicate that he'd been anywhere near the deceased's house. So therein ended that line of investigation. But these things take time. That takes a number of days to sort out. So we move on. Then you go back to Patrick Hanrahan, and we asked him if he was prepared to give his DNA, and he said, yeah, I'll give you my DNA sample. A week later, he comes back negative.
Patrick Hanrahan told police about another palm reader, Andrew Fitzherbert, who worked at the church and was the de facto partner of Ruth Bennett. Ruth was a member of the Cat Protection Society and an ally of Virginia Houston.
But all that did for me was say, OK, well, there's another male I've got to exclude because, you know, he's now added to the list of associates of Virginia Houston. Ruth Bennett is an identified associate of Virginia Houston, and Andrew Fitzherbert is her male partner. So I'll have to get him excluded as well.
And there was another man police were yet to exclude, John Wilson, who had made the 1 o'clock appointment for his cat.
We could not find John Wilson. We didn't know who he was. Did another press release asking for anyone to come forward who'd been to the surgery, and we actually specified on that day.
We are interested in talking to people that attended Kathleen Marshall's house in the last week of February 1998, especially those people that attended with a sick or injured animal.
He still didn't come forward. It was then only on the 12th of June that Ruth Bennett appeared in the Courier Mail nursing a Siamese cat. This is when we start to put it all together. Ruth Bennett lives with Andrew Fitzherbert, he's a partner, and they've got a Siamese cat. The Lachardis have seen a man carrying a Siamese cat walking towards the house.
He was standing within about a foot of the back of the bus, and I thought, well, if I mess up the clutch, I'll hit him and the cat, and I didn't want that, so I called him and I said, would you mind moving away from the vehicle, sir? And he didn't respond, he didn't move, he just stood there.
It now appeared the detectives had found their elusive John Wilson. But before they could jump directly to that conclusion, they needed to confirm with the Lachardis that he was the man they saw on the day Kathleen died.
There was no photograph on record of Andrew Fitzherbert by the Queensland Police or any other police service in Australia, but we identified that he had a passport, and a passport photo had been taken some years prior. We obtained a copy of that passport photograph and displayed that to the Lachardis in the usual format of a photo board.
They asked us to have a look at some photos and see what, if we could identify the man. I picked, I think it was number 9. I know it was down on the left-hand corner of the board. And the only difference that I could see in that picture was that it was a smiling picture. The man I saw was definitely not smiling.
Mrs. Liccardi was able to identify Andrew Fitzherbert from the photo board as the person that she had seen outside Kathleen Marshall's residence on Thursday the 26th of February.
Do you have any grounds at all for associating in any way with this man?
Have you had contact with Kathleen Marshall?
No.
Have you ever
met Kathleen Marshall at all under any circumstance? All I know of I have met Virginia Houston. I know Virginia Houston fairly well.
Have you ever been to Kathleen Marshall's street or to her house?
I don't even know where she lives.
Have you ever spoken to her over the telephone? No.
That denial was key information for the detectives. They knew that a phone call had come into Kathleen Marshall's home from the Bennett Fitzherbert residence 2 days before Kathleen had died, and was potentially the call that set up John Wilson's 1 o'clock appointment.
We stated that we had direct links between his residence and Kathleen Marshall's residence on the days prior to. He denied this, and we again reiterated that we had the links through phone records. At this point, he began to physically shake almost to the point where it was uncontrollable.
I haven't met the woman.
Yeah, that's right. That's fine, Andrew. No, and that's
the case. You're a person that has nothing to lose and everything to gain.
And Andrew, all that we're asking you to do is supply a specimen to eliminate you from our inquiries. That's it. That's the bottom line.
Got to test Andrew because he made an application to join the Cat Society and he was rejected. So that's
well, Ruth, we don't know.
I have heard of that.
Ruth, we've
got alibis for the whole weekend.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But all I'm saying is we can finish this up in a few minutes. That's all that we're saying to you, Ruth.
Well, I think I'm going to say no. No, I am not going to give you samples. I will give you samples if and when. I'm not going to give you samples. It's as simple as that.
We took him into custody. He declined an interview. He was what we would classify as someone who was very DNA aware. He had quite literally sat in the one position for over 6 hours, had not gone to the toilet, had not drunk anything. He knew what he could and couldn't do to ensure that he wouldn't leave traces of his DNA.
The latest focus of the homicide inquiry left Nunda Police Station this afternoon, accompanied by his lawyer, despite intense speculation that police were about to announce a breakthrough in the investigation of murdered vet Kathleen Marshall. The man was released after more than 6 hours of questioning. Police had intended taking a blood sample, but the move was thwarted in the courts after a magistrate ruled there was insufficient evidence.
Police were now going to have to find another strategy to get the DNA they so desperately needed to nab the person they believed was Kathleen's killer.
Mr. Fitzherbert.
How are you? Well, not bad, but we would prefer that you did not come through the door, thank you.
Andrew Fitzherbert was an unlikely suspect in the murder of Kathleen Marshall, but when he was identified as the mysterious John Wilson, who hadn't been found on the day Kathleen was murdered, their suspicions arose.
Andrew, and as I was saying to you, you seem to be a reasonable man. And if I can put one more appeal to you, is that this can all be finalised in a matter of seconds if we can obtain those samples. And that's all that we need to do. We can get out of your hair and eliminate you as a suspect, as a person of interest in relation to this matter.
Well, I'm not giving my consent. It's as simple as that.
But I can't understand the reasons why.
Why, if he was innocent, why was he causing such hassle to get his DNA? You know, was he standing on principle that much? You know, wouldn't it have been easier just to say, OK, you can have it, rather than cause the police to drag him into court?
While police couldn't force Andrew Fitzherbert to give blood unless they were prepared to charge him with murder, they were able to get a search warrant for his home. There, they hoped to find items that would contain samples of his DNA.
Execution of search warrant. We have a warrant to execute. We'd appreciate if you could put the dog out the back for us while we search the house.
Hello, Mr. Fitzherbert. How are you? Well, not bad, but we would prefer that you did not come through the door, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Fitzherbert, what's happened is we've got a search warrant for these premises.
A search warrant for the premises.
He was quite surprised to see us. He didn't seem prepared for the fact that we'd come armed with a search warrant and were looking for personal items.
Yes, in other words, you have a right to remain silent. You understand that? Yes. You have the right to contact the solicitor if you wish.
Daddy, can't you shut that door?
Ruth Pennant was abusive towards us. She wasn't happy at all that we were there. We'd already been with her de facto for some 8 hours that day. We'd failed in a court attempt to obtain his DNA through legal means, and she believed this was just nothing more than a case of police harassment.
During the course of the search, we took possession of a number of personal items which related directly to Andrew Fitzherbert. These items included his hairbrush, his toothbrush, his pillowcase, his sheets, his socks, his coffee cup, and a hanky which he had in his pocket.
Among those items, it was the last. Fitzherbert's handkerchief held the DNA evidence that put him at the crime scene.
You've been investigating a matter like this for some months, trying to identify who the DNA belonged to. We now had an identification. So obviously he had to justify his DNA being at a crime scene.
Andrew Richard Fitzherbert was first arrested 2 days ago for refusing a police bid to obtain a blood sample for DNA testing. But the 49-year-old was released after a court ruling found police could only demand blood if he was arrested for the murder. That happened early this morning when he presented himself at Brisbane Watch House with a lawyer.
While a handkerchief was an indication they had the right man, it could be argued that it was used by someone else. But now, with the charge of murder, police could insist on a blood sample from Fitzherbert for comparison testing.
Andrew Fitzherbert's blood was an exact match for the blood that was located in the surgery at Kathleen Marshall's residence.
17 months after her death, Kathleen's accused went to trial.
This morning, Andrew Fitzherbert pleaded not guilty to murder. Prosecutors claim the most damning evidence is based on DNA testing. The jury was told a magistrate ordered Fitzherbert to give blood, which matched samples taken at the scene. DNA tests revealed only one person in 14 times 10 to the power of 15 could match. The Crown claimed there was no word for such a number, the extraordinary odds proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Fitzherbert is the killer.
And if there was any argument that he bled there at some other occasion than at the time of the murder, one critical piece of forensic evidence would seal his fate.
The plastic bag on the surgery seat was identified as being a mixture of the deceased blood and an unknown male's blood. But I think it was significant finding male and female blood together in the one mixture, because we could say that the offender and the deceased had shed blood at the same time, and in doing so their blood had come into contact together.
Kathleen Marshall's murder has been likened to a sensational mystery novel. This afternoon, the final chapter concluded when Fitzherbert was found guilty. The jury took 3.5 hours to return its verdict. Judge Ken McKenzie immediately sentenced Fitzherbert to 15 years jail, conceding if it hadn't been for an explosion in genetic technology, he may have walked free.
Evidence of alibi was offered during the trial, but the evidence, the scientific evidence we had in relation to the DNA at the crime scene, along with his denials of ever being at the crime scene, were too compellable to the jury.
When he was found guilty, I don't think I was really surprised, but you've got to have a reason for doing something. So where was the motive for this murder? And the only thing that we could think of, the motive was in the cat.
During the course of the investigation, it was identified that Andrew Fitzherbert and Ruth Bennett were the owner of 2 Siamese cats, Jasper and Zilla. Zilla went missing around about the time that Kathleen Marshall's body was located.
Now, the cat was pregnant. He may have presented himself there with the cat and something's happened to the cat.
We're wondering if he could have perhaps brought a cat to Kathleen, the cat escaped or something like that. An argument started and Fitzherbert crashed against the louvers. and got himself cut. There are various theories to that end wandering around.
There's a lot of people who can't, they just find it so frustrating that they were put through all this pain and suffering and trauma, and they still don't know what happened.
It doesn't frustrate me. I think it frustrates more the people that knew Kathleen Marshall. They'd like an explanation of why a person's life could be ended for what? For what appears like a few theories that it might be over a cat. They'd like to think there's something more to it, but until Andrew Fitzherbert talks, we'll never know, or they'll never know.
Andrew Fitzherbert can apply for parole in 2014, but unless he admits to Kathleen's murder and shows some remorse, his release is unlikely.